Welcome back to our course on establishing the foundations of outcome-centric selling. And in this module, we're going to build on what we learned about the different types of buying decision journey and look into it in more detail. So, quick reminder of the two key questions that are going to have a very significant influence when we're trying to determine our prospects' likely buying behavior. So, firstly, do they regard this as an inevitable or a discretionary purchase? And that might change during their buying decision journey. Changes in circumstances can turn what appeared to be an inevitable purchase into a discretionary or optional one, and what appeared at first to be discretionary purchases can turn into inevitable ones. And the second question is, so are they engaged in what they regard as a familiar or an unfamiliar decision process? And that can change as well during their buying decision journey, their perception of it. Typically, when our prospect realizes maybe they're actually less familiar with all the factors involved in making a successful buying decision for this type of solution than they initially thought. So let's look more deeply now into the difference between inevitable and discretionary purchases. So if it's an inevitable purchase, as we've seen, action is inevitable. Their circumstances dictate that they must buy or do something. Continuing with the status quo they have decided is not a viable option. They are convinced that bad things will happen if they do nothing. So their key considerations, of course, are what exactly they do need to buy or do, who they're going to buy it from, how they're going to decide, and when they've got to decide by. Now, if it's a discretionary purchase, on the other hand, action is not inevitable. They might, at the end of the day, agree they do need to do something, or they might decide they can live with the status quo after all. Now, the consequences of doing nothing under these circumstances might be uncomfortable, but the prospect does not consider them to be unmanageable. And before they can proceed here, they need to decide whether they need to do anything before they then turn their attention, if they conclude that action does prove to be necessary. They need to work out what they need to do, who they'll do it with, how they'll choose, and when they need to decide by. So we need to be very careful not to confuse the two. If we treat what is really a discretionary purchase as if it were an inevitable one, that assumption has very serious and usually negative consequences for the success of our sales strategy. And then what about familiar versus unfamiliar purchases? Because that's going to affect their buying behavior as well. So if they're involved in a familiar purchase, they typically will have successfully purchased something similar before. And because of that, they're likely to be more confident about their decision criteria and their decision process. And because of that, they may not want to engage a salesperson until their process is very well advanced, or they may not want to engage a salesperson at all. Now, if we want them to engage earlier, then we need to persuade them that we can introduce fresh perspectives and insights into their buying decision process. This is not about making a product pitch. It's about sharing valuable insights that cause them to maybe reconsider how they're going about things. Now, if it's an unfamiliar purchase, now while their company may have a generic buying or procurement process, but they have never successfully purchased anything similar to this project before. So almost inevitably, and sometimes helpfully, they're likely to be less confident about their ability to make a high quality decision. That means they're more likely to be concerned about the fear of messing up, about the costs and consequences of making a bad decision. So if we identify that they're on an unfamiliar buying process, we need to build trust. And we need to do that by helping them to facilitate their buying decision criteria and process. Now, having an established corporate buying or procurement process does not automatically mean, and very often doesn't mean, that they'll be confident in their ability to make a high quality, unfamiliar buying decision. They're likely to need help. So let's drill into each of these. What if their purchase appears to be inevitable? And even if that does appear to the case, we must guard against the project being deprioritized. So why is this important? Well, people and the organizations they work for, including I imagine your own, will always have more things they want to do than they have the resources to actually implement them. Those priorities can change. And that means that already budgeted projects can be deprioritized, taken off the hot list at any time, driven by either internal or external events. And even if the project appears to have been budgeted, there is always the risk that those funds can be shifted to something that the customer now regards as more important. So we cannot afford to be complacent, even if our champion assures us that the project is inevitably going to go ahead. So here's what we can and we must do, even for inevitable purchases. One, we need to help our prospect to build the strongest possible business case. We need to ensure that our prospect fully recognizes the costs and negative consequences and implications of staying on their current path. We need to recognize that our strongest competition often comes not from other similar vendors, but from other projects. And yes, from the status quo, do nothing. So we need to make sure, even if their purchase appears to be inevitable, that our prospect recognizes and agrees why they need to change and why that change is urgent. Now, what if their purchase appears to be discretionary? Well, those sort of projects always run the risk of being deprioritized, delayed, or abandoned. So why is this important? Well, again, people and the organizations they work for always have more things they want to do than they have the resources to actually implement them. So only the currently most important projects tend to get funded and approved. If our prospect thinks they might be able to do without, they almost certainly will. And without strong momentum, without widespread internal support, projects tend to either linger or get cancelled. So knowing this, what can we do? Well, we need to start by assessing whether we can help our prospect to recognize the reasons why this project might actually be a must-have and not a nice-to-have. If the project appears to be a low priority, or if it's got a weak business case, then honestly, we need to seriously consider whether we ought to politely disqualify this as an actively forecast opportunity and maybe instead implement a nurturing strategy. But if we can see a path to making the project a higher or even better inevitable priority, we need to collaborate with the customer to build that strongest possible business case, not just for our solution, but for the project as a whole. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the type of buying process. Now, if they regard their buying process as well proven and familiar, well, quite often they're going to delay wanting to engage salespeople until late in the process, at the point where they feel they have no other option. Why is this important? Well, you know, when prospects think that their buying process is well understood, it's well proven, it's familiar, it's been successful in the past, they tend to think they don't need external help. And that often means they often avoid engaging with salespeople until they feel they absolutely must. And honestly, that sort of decision is often compounded by past bad experiences with pushy, over aggressive, and incompetent salespeople. Now, if we can't address this, we run the risk of being unable to influence their thinking until it's too late. We run the risk of being forced into reactive mode and to meekly following their process rather than actively facilitating it. So, some implications about what we can and must do if we identify the customer believes their buying process is well proven and familiar. Well, we need to look for ways to open our prospects' eyes to the fact that their decision journey may not actually be as simple and straightforward as they might have thought. We can do this by introducing status quo challenging insights, anecdotes, customer stories, relating to perhaps changes in external circumstances. And we can also do that by asking implication questions. So even if they think their process is familiar, we might ask them, how would you deal with this issue? Perhaps knowing that their current thinking doesn't really cover that. Or have you thought about this issue and who would be affected by it? And so on. So implication questions can be very powerful in unpicking or unlocking what appears right now to be a very familiar buying process. So our goal has got to be to help them to recognize that making the best possible decision may not be as straightforward as they thought, and that we can help them in that process. And what about fourth element, an unfamiliar buying process? Now, if they recognize they're entering new territory, if they realize that they haven't successfully purchased similar solutions in the past, well, then they're much more likely to take advice from a salesperson if and only if we approach them in the right way. So why is this important? Well, if the prospect does realize they're embarked on this unfamiliar buying journey, they're more likely to seek out and accept advice. They might try to do that from consultants, from members of their peer group, and so on. And that means they might be more likely to be willing to engage with us at an earlier stage. But there's a caveat. They need to believe that that early engagement will result in them learning something valuable rather than being subjected to a crude sales pitch. Now, this willingness to engage early, if we manage it effectively, can give us the chance to significantly influence their buying decision criteria and their process in our favor. So, what can we and must we do if we think that our customers embarking on an unfamiliar process? Well, we need to focus our initial outreach and conversation with them on sharing experiences of other similar organizations in the form of insights, anecdotes, stories that enable them to make better informed buying decisions. And this is so important. We've got to resist the itch to pitch our company or our solution too early, before we've established trust, before we've educated them on how valuable some of our insights might prove to managing a successful buying process. And we need to help them figure out for themselves why they need to change, why change is urgent, and how to choose the most effective option. Now, establishing this sort of foundation as a trusted advisor will put us in a much stronger position to ultimately win their business. So, a quick reminder, customers have different buying behaviors. They behave in different ways, depending on whether they regard their purchase as inevitable or discretionary, and whether they see their decision process as familiar or unfamiliar. And we need to implement different strategies accordingly. If they in the familiar and inevitable box, if they see themselves as painting by numbers or something similar, then assuming the opportunity is well qualified, then our primary sales challenges are to persuade our prospect to choose us rather than any other option, and to persuade them to act sooner rather than later. That's probably the simplest of the four paths and strategies. But what if they're in a discretionary purchase or involved in a discretionary purchase, but at least they're using what they see as a familiar decision process? I'd referred to that as marching into the unknown, discretionary plus familiar. Well, if you think about it, we've effectively got two parallel challenges. The first one is to persuade our prospect they need to take urgent action rather than sticking with the status quo. And the second is that they need to choose us rather than any other option. Now, what happens if they're in the third box? It is an inevitable purchase. They have to do something, but they're moving into unknown territory. It's an unfamiliar decision process. Well, then we have a really important role to act as a trusted advisor and help them to understand how to successfully manage that relatively unfamiliar buying process, whilst, of course, at the same time, persuading them to choose us and to take urgent action. And what if they're in the fourth combination? It is a discretionary purchase, which may or may not happen, and they're in unfamiliar territory. They might behave a bit as if they're running around in the fog. We might not want to say that to them, of course. So in this fourth box, we need to convince them that they need to take action. We need to help them to manage a successful buying journey. We need to persuade them to choose us, and we need to persuade them to act sooner rather than later. And you can see how the movement from a bottom left to top right type of buying journey involves significantly increasing effort and complexity. But very often, because those top right types of buying journey are amongst the most valuable, the effort often has its rewards. And remember, on top of all of that, if they are a new customer, on top of all of this, we need to convince them to trust us to ensure that they are actually going to achieve their desired outcomes if they decide to work with us. So I'm going to suggest an exercise that might help you put into context what you've just learned. And I want you to choose one of your most significant current active opportunities. And I want you to think about what we've just discussed. And I want you to think about whether that opportunity appears to be an inevitable or a discretionary purchase. And what makes you think that? What evidence can you point to? And I also want you to think about whether your customer is behaving as if they're engaged in a familiar or an unfamiliar buying process. And what makes you think that? Where's the evidence for thinking that? So, do they appear to be painting by numbers, to be marching into the unknown, to be orienteering or running in the fog? And why do you think that? And where's the evidence? So, if you step back and apply this perspective, how might this perspective help shape your strategies and your tactics for winning their business? And if you take everything into account, what is the genuine likelihood that your prospect will actually do anything rather than sticking with the status quo? That's a particular consideration for discretionary purchases. And you also need to consider the likelihood, if they do decide to take action, that they're going to choose you, and what evidence you can point to for believing that. And if you apply all of this thinking, I want you to consider what impact could all of that have on your currently rated probability of winning and your currently projected close date? And if there are a number of unknowns or things you're not at all sure about or now worried about, what specifically you're going to do about it? So I really recommend you start that with one of your most important current opportunities. You apply the thinking, you learn from it, and then I hope you'll realize the value of applying this perspective to all of your other current and future significant high impact opportunities. So we've reached that time where I want to encourage you to pause and reflect. I want to ask you how this particular module might have helped you to think differently, how the ideas that I've shared are now going to help you to change the way you think about the importance of understanding the different types of buying decision journeys in relationship to the concepts that I've just shared with you. But again, even more important, after you have had your time for reflection, what are you now determined to start doing? What do you now realize you need to stop doing? And how are you going to make what you were already doing even more effective as a result of applying this thinking? And yes, I do want you to pause, to reflect, and I want to encourage you to write your conclusions down, because it's much more likely that you'll put them into practice if you've documented them, and then come back and revisit and, if necessary, refine those commitments to yourself. So there we have it. We've looked at some of the deeper implications of the different types of buying journey. And I hope you found those ideas relevant and helpful, and that you want to apply them to your most important current and future opportunities. And of course, I wish you the very, very best of success in doing that. And I also hope that you're looking forward to joining me in the next online module. We're going to turn our attention to understanding the different phases of the prospects buying decision journey. And I hope to see you online for that in the very near future.